Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Skalicki with On Point Communications, bringing you our next episode of Getting to the Point, where I bring to you the expert in his or her field that you just need to hear from today. And I'm really excited to bring to you today Steve Brody. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks.
Good. So glad to have you. Steve is the former vice president of marketing at Coca-Cola, and he has some really awesome stories about his time there. But he's transitioned now into executive coach, and he works with CEOs of privately held firms in the middle market area. Steve works at the intersection of three key circles, if you can imagine in your mind, three kind of concentric circles. Those would be leadership, those would be strategic planning, and those would be, thinking about exit and succession plans. Steve, I'm going to let you do a little bit more of an intro, and you can share with us a little bit more about your expertise. And I'll just say that you and I met through a common LinkedIn connection and have been getting to know each other through our posts, through some meet and greet calls. And I've just really enjoyed the wisdom you bring, the humility, the expertise, and just your passion for giving first. So I'm glad to have you today. Tell us a little more about you and your journey.
Yeah. So thanks, Cindy. And I've been happy to meet you with the consultant we've both been using to help identify how to more effectively use LinkedIn to look at potential prospects and clients. Yep. So I like to tell someone new, or let's say a new prospect that I'm meeting with, that I'm in what I consider to be the third phase of my career. I have yet to determine how many phases there are.
Okay, I love it.
What those phases are, that journey for me has spanned several different types of companies. And what I mean by that is phase one was the corporate world. So I joined the Coca-Cola company back in the early 70s. Okay. After college and graduate school. And I moved to Texas to a division that was owned by Coke, that today that division is called the Minute Maid Company.
Yeah, okay.
It reports to Atlanta, and it was about $2 billion in revenue at the time. And I was there for 16 years, and my activity focused on brand and product management. So new product development, existing brands, consumer trends, and where those beverages were going to go was all phase one. Then I was recruited away from Coke into phase two, which was running actually privately held companies. So for the next 10 years, I was a hired gun. I ran 4 different firms sequentially that were all owned by equity groups, by private equity or venture capital groups. So none of these companies were startup businesses. Okay. They were already in business, but they were regional or growing, and the investors had a board of directors, and they were looking for someone to help take the company to the next level. And so I was brought in as president of these and had 4 different companies that were either product or service oriented. And most of that focus was on growing the business, growing it, and then eventually looking at some type of exit, the way these venture groups operate, which is a whole different conversation about.
Yes, it is. Exactly.
What the world calls these people sharks, and what you see on some of the media like Shark Tank is a very interesting example of what happens when people need money or they need capital, and where do they go for that capital if you can't go to a traditional bank. So that's kind of the whole scenario. That was phase two. After doing that for 10 years and buying some companies, selling some companies, I then decided to go into an area to work on my own, but not to start a business. I really had no interest in starting a business.
Any particular reason?
I thought people that started companies, Cindy, were crazy.
Crazy.
Why would you take the kind of risk that the different definitions of risk that some bank, that you're gonna have to sign away your house, sign away all of
Yeah.
your, and it's like, I thought, why would anybody do
Why
that?
would they're crazy, right?
They're crazy.
Well, that's great.
But
Well,
they wanted to have more control of something is the
mhm,
actual, they didn't want to have to report to other people. But in any case, what was an interesting mix for me is I became a coach. I affiliated with a company that is the world's largest CEO
mhm,
and membership
yeah,
company today called Vistage
yeah,
Worldwide.
yes,
And
yes.
it's a company that runs peer groups.
Hmm.
People that are members of that typically are private and don't have a board of directors. And
Right.
so it's helping those business owners develop themselves personally and professionally and look at where they're going to grow and how they're going to grow with these businesses. And so that's been the last 20 years.
Oh,
That's
wow. Okay. I didn't realize it was that many years, but I know, yeah, we definitely have certain areas of that are in common as far as, a lot of my clients and in this, I see as they start, right, and start up, and then they end up in funding or Series A or further, and I'm working with so many present clients who need someone like you because of that growth mindset. They're just growing so fast or so rapidly with the funding, right, that comes in. In fact, I was just on the phone yesterday with someone. She went from 3 people to 20 in 1 year because of a huge government grant that was awarded to her, and now she's swimming in organizational chaos. And so let's get into this because it's a really exciting learning that you can provide to all who are watching. But I know we're gonna center our 3 points today around, kind of how you help people. But maybe tell us. I know we're going to talk a little bit about who you serve. Like what is a middle market person? Maybe before we hit the 3 points, tell us
yeah.
who's a good
So,
fit for the program. Mm-hmm.
a bunch of people like me that are either in the consulting world or the coaching world will have to define who is that target. And sometimes you'll be dealing with a very, very large company. It might be a publicly traded company. Those are not the ones that I am focused on today. I'm not
Okay.
focused on those. The niche that I'm continuing with those last efforts that I was involved with when I left Vistage in 2019,
Mm-hmm.
that niche is privately held companies.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, those businesses represent, most people don't know this that are not connected to the business world, but they represent the majority of employment in the United States.
That's
But
incredible.
that doesn't really get the headlines because
No, it doesn't.
it's hard to talk about those companies that you don't often have the information. It's easier to talk about Apple or Google or
Mm-hmm.
someone who's
Sure.
public or Facebook, and then you can get a lot of information. But most of our economy is based on these private companies. And so what is a middle market company?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a broad definition, and depending on who you talk to, I would say that on the low, and since it's not a startup business that I'm describing,
Mm-hmm.
on the low end, it's about $5 million in revenue,
Okay.
five to 10, let's say, in revenue. And that might be 20, 30 employees, 20, 30, 40 employees, up to, on the high side of this range of middle market, up to about 500 million in
Okay.
revenue.
It's a big
And
range, right? Mm-hmm.
that could be 400 or 500 employees and someone that is their product or service
Mm-hmm.
they're actually offering in multiple markets and
Mm-hmm.
multiple.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's a pretty wide scope. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not someone who's a $1 billion firm. It's not the really, really large, what you would
Right.
find in a public company. And it's not a startup. And
Right.
what you said, it was interesting, the client or conversation you said you had with someone that grew so rapidly within a year that, a really interesting question. A lot of people would say, well, how fast do you want to grow?
Mm-hmm.
And people would make the assumption, I want to grow as much as I can. And that's actually not a very good answer.
No, it's not.
You
Right.
use the word chaos. You use the word chaos, right?
Yeah, right.
There are actually a lot of experts that talk about kind of an optimal growth rate. And it's
Hmm.
not doubling, tripling, quadrupling within a year,
Yeah.
because often what'll happen is you run out of cash.
Yeah.
You run,
Right.
it's a big problem.
Hmm.
And so you now get into a lot of discussion and metrics about what would be a more gradual and manageable type of growth rate.
Right. More strategy behind the
Yeah,
growth and why, and then how to further, do the stages, kind of like your career that you had mentioned. There's stages of growth for a company, for a person's career, the whole bit. So, well, Steve, I know you're doing a you have seats open for a mastermind program, and I want to dive into the things that you do with those folks once you kind of get them to take a look at themselves and understand the need for a person like you to help them and to be their guide because of your great breadth and depth of experience. You have the tools that these leaders really need, and I love that you can create that confidential space for them that is really important at their level. So let's go ahead and start with our first point. I know your primary growth goals is kind of point one here that you
yeah.
wanted to reach out
So
and
that
talk about.
audience, so the audience actually can be one of two, but the mastermind group is a peer group. It's similar to what I was doing when I was
Mm-hmm.
involved with the Vistage. So it's creating another one of those on my own, of putting CEOs and founders together that are not competitors to each other, so that they'd
Right.
be willing. So it's a group that can do that and meet periodically to share some of the goals and priorities. Or it's someone individual, someone
Okay.
who, for whatever reason, doesn't want to join a group right now, but still has the same needs. So,
Yep.
um, let's just define that first area, which in terms of helping them understand the growth and goal that they're dealing with, because
Mm-hmm.
every private company has a challenge. It has a challenge and a task of if they have a team, let's say they have some people that report to them and they're dependent on those people and they're proud of those people, but that owner or founder, let's assume that he or she owns all the equity of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the challenge that I'm describing is, so how much do they share and what amount of information do they share and develop with the team? And
Mm-hmm.
one of the first areas to focus on is that growth question.
Right.
How much do they want to grow and how are they going to get there?
Right.
And the growth can be looked at in two ways. One is personal and the
Mm-hmm.
second is professional.
Okay.
What I
Perfect.
mean by that is, how do they grow as an individual? How do they grow as a leader or an
Right.
individual? And then how do they grow professionally in terms of their role as the CEO or whatever their role happens? Some of these people come in, they have a sales background.
Mm-hmm.
Some have an operations background.
Mm-hmm.
Some have a finance background. Of, but they're not a jack of all trades.
Right.
And one of the statements that you'll hear is that it's been said that a fear, one of the biggest fears of a CEO is being found out.
Yes, I was going to ask you this, so you're doing it already. But yeah, I love that
And
makes a
what
lot of
that
sense.
means,
Tell me a little bit more about what that feeling
what
is.
does that mean, being found out?
Yeah.
Let's say you've got 50 employees or some number like that. Being found out, those employees all look at you as the owner or the founder. Their assumption is that you're supposed to know, and they expect you to know all of the answers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, being found out means that it's more common that a CEO or founder actually doesn't know
Mm-hmm.
all of those answers. So
Mm-hmm.
then what are they supposed to do? And that's the first fear. That's the
Okay.
first fear of
Okay.
being found out.
And there's some vulnerability that kind of needs to come into play there, but also that can be, fielded by you as the coach, right? And then determine sort of how and if to bring some of that into the workplace, because vulnerability is so important when you're with a leader. You don't want to know all the things they don't know, but you do want to know that they're human, there's an authenticity to them, and you can probably help them strike that balance,
Sure.
right?
Well, and not to get into too many details of it because we don't have the time
Right.
today, but I can mention just a few of those pieces. Meaning in that first area, the first area of the intersection of those three circles that we talked about, the first one is the leadership one, when I said personal or professional. And how do we get at that? How do I help them do that? Well, I use an assessment that's one of the well-known instruments and personality. There's a bunch of them out there, but I'm a certified reseller of a tool that's called the Berkman profile.
Okay.
So if we're going to talk about your leadership traits and what you are as a leader, some of these tools are really helpful for you to take an instrument, spend 20, 30 minutes, and then I get the results and can walk you through what does your natural behavior look like, and how does it come across to other people. So we start with the assessment of what do you look like as a leader. So that's the first major tool.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense.
Leadership development.
Super.
That's the first area.
Right. Well, do you want to go ahead and jump into point 2 now that we've got
the second area? So after we talk about leadership and go on to that, which is kind of an ongoing conversation, then the second area leads to what's the plan? What is the direction? What's the direction for the company? Meaning what priorities are we going to deal with?
Right.
And we have to identify, and with each company, it's going to be different depending on where they are in their stage of growth, stage of development. But what are their priorities? And the key in doing that is not to focus on just an encyclopedia, not to focus on 5 or 10 priorities. But a really difficult thing to do is ask someone, can you narrow down these priorities to just 3? Or how about 2? Or how about 1?
Yeah, right.
Say, oh, no, I can't do that. We have to do this, this, and this. And well, the problem is if you have too many things, too many priorities, then do you really have a priority?
Well, pri means 1, right? I mean, so you're supposed to only have 1 priority, right? When it comes down to,
it's hard to limit it to 1.
Very hard. Steve, I have a question about that. Do you think that could lend to, do you see in someone with a lot of priorities, sometimes a need to be better at delegating? Because I could see that answer being maybe, but maybe not. Like the company still needs priorities that are less than 5, but it could also be around delegating, maybe. I'm wondering.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word earlier and asked about vulnerability, and it relates back to that fear comment that I said about someone found out, because you see, so much of this comes into what their personality is and what do they think they're supposed to be doing as a leader. And so if they think they're supposed to do everything and to know everything and be in control of everything, then that's a very, draw a pyramid, that's a very top-down type of approach. And it often doesn't end up developing leaders or people, because, is some person, a CEO or founder, going to be good at everything? And so the ability to delegate, or their willingness to delegate, is also a rather large challenge when you're the owner. I mean, and let me give you a specific example. I had someone, I have a client who's up to about 300 million in revenue, and he was the founder of the business. He created and founder. He's a distributor, and he's a beer, wine, and liquor distribution company.
Good friend to have, right?
Yeah, good for him. And especially during the, his business is way up because of,
Right, right. He's
right.
growing.
But the mindset is, here's the difficulty. He remembers, and he's in his 40s. He's a fairly
Okay.
young person. He
Mhm.
remembers when the business was only $10 million.
Mhm.
And at that point, he could do almost everything and
Mhm.
people would come to him. But the business isn't $10 million anymore.
Mhm.
And the temptation for often an individual like that to try to get into too many things and say, well, it's their money, they have to control it. That's a very circular discussion because it leads to the kind of organization that maybe does not develop people to think on their own. They
Right,
just say, well, I'm going to go to Cindy, or I'm going to go to someone and just
right.
ask her what I should do. And that doesn't really help you to develop a strong organization.
Mhm. Mhm. Right.
That's a challenge. It's a
Yeah.
challenge if you think of it as that, well, you're the person and it's your money, and are you willing to delegate to some of your people? And how do we define that? How much are you willing to delegate? And to
Yeah.
what degree?
I have an image in my mind right now. I feel like what you do is you take like the box of the 1,000-piece puzzle, which is your leader, and you help them spread it onto the table and get pieces really on the table separated. Because, and what I'm getting at is overwhelm, which I'm guessing a lot of your clients have when they
Yeah.
get to you. And when you're in overwhelm, you can't think clearly or see clearly. And so you're just feeling like you're inside this dark box of puzzle pieces. But if Steve can get it all out on the table, and then, hey, we're going to just work on the edge pieces, that is it, because that's going to frame the work, right?
Well,
So
yeah. And so there are things that are available that are published and widely out there. It's not that it's brand new in that area about what to focus on and where are they going to go with that. That second area, I use a tool called the Rockefeller habits.
okay.
It's a whole model that it describes how you run a company and how you identify the goals and who you share it with and what's called the KPIs, which that
Yep.
acronym stands for key performance indicator.
Mhm.
So are you willing to, we get into some very interesting things about in a business of how much is someone's personal behavior and what should they do within the company.
Mhm.
How much are these things aligned, or are they different? Do they think, oh no, well, I couldn't share with people what our revenue or profit is?
Right.
Well, why not? Well, that's a secret. I mean, suppose that they found that out and could do and would take that to a competitor, what would happen? And there's a lot of fascinating stories
Oh
about
gosh, Steve, you're bringing up to me the boss I worked for when I was a young professional. He ran the PR firm that I had joined right after I got married. His name is John Sang, and he was just the model of the type of person I wanted to work for. And exactly what you're saying, he was not afraid to do. Like he just always openly shared where the business was, what was happening. And I am telling you, we had such a feeling of camaraderie and teamwork that we were all going to go back to our desks and work toward whatever that number or goal or achievement was with him as our guide. And instead of having no idea and just feeling like a worker bee, we were participating in the vision. And there was such a difference in how that felt
oh,
from
yeah,
below.
that's
And it's
super.
because he opened up himself and his vulnerabilities. And so if there are leaders watching, I personally am such a proponent of you sharing the numbers, right? The details. I mean, not the nitty gritty and the P&Ls, but
Yeah.
that is so formative to a culture of growth in
Well,
my mind.
people think that it's often such a secret when it's
Yeah,
a private, and there's a lot of comparisons we make when we're looking at and talking
sure.
about leadership, comparisons to sports that or in
Hmm.
a team that
Yeah.
apply. And just one quick example, in Vince Lombardi, in football, and the great
Hmm.
football coach,
Hmm.
that is similar to running a business, because they would have a playbook. They would have a playbook
Yeah.
that would be their secret plays, and people thought that didn't understand. They thought that, well, the secret is in that playbook. So if I could
Mhm.
only get a copy of his
Yeah.
playbook,
Yeah.
we could beat the Green Bay Packers. And
Right.
Lombardi was famous for saying, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the playbook. Here's
We're
the
still going to
playbook,
beat you.
because
Right.
you won't know. Here's all the plays, and there may be 20, 30, 40 of them, whatever. But you, the competitor, you won't know which one we're going to run and how. And
Yeah. And
even if
when? Yeah.
even if you knew which play it is, we're going to be so good at execution that you won't be able to stop us anyhow.
I
So
love
that is
that.
the secret. That's
That's
not the secret.
awesome. Yeah. Oh, that's a great example. Good value bomb right there. Well, let's go to our third piece today, Steve, about like succession and exit plan. So you've talked with this, founder or this leader, right, about creating goals, identifying priorities. Talk to us about succession, and then maybe for some, it's an exit plan. Because I've worked with a few folks who would be great clients of yours about M&A and how to exit companies. And so what do you mean by that third
Sure.
point?
So the exiters, I mean, and this relates to the future and where things are going to go, where the company is going to go. And again, in a privately held company, a little different than a very large or public company, where you will have, by definition, a board of directors,
Right.
that if something were to happen to you, that leader, if a health issue or something else, or if someone were to die, you would have a board that would make a decision. But in a privately held company, the vast majority of privately held firms don't have a board of directors.
Mm-hmm.
So the future, here's another one of the challenges that I mentioned in a privately held firm. And it has been said by people that there are only two ways to exit a company.
Mm-hmm.
One is vertical and the other is horizontal.
Okay.
What that means, not to be kind of morbid here,
Yeah.
vertical means you choose to do something, you choose to leave, or to sell, or to transition to something else. You want to move
Right.
into another, but you leave willingly, and you make a choice, and there's something that you do. That's
Right.
leaving
Yep.
vertically. Leaving horizontally means you're carried out, Cindy.
Yes. Right.
Now,
And not on people's shoulders. I don't think that's what you
some
mean.
people know. And so, but the dilemma part, and this is just not about crisis or death, but the difference in a private company and someone else that is public or has a board of directors, in a private company, if something were to happen to you, who is the founder and one that everyone looks to, the question and the challenge here, let's say you have 100 or 200 employees, the challenge becomes now, what happens to the company? What
Right.
happens if
Yeah.
something isn't planned?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so therefore, while we can't control everything in a
Mm-hmm.
business, but we can think about, we
Yeah.
all know that at some point, we all know there's a destination that all
Yes.
of us have. And that destination, depending on what religion you are, is either going to be heaven or it's going to be, but there's a
Right.
destination where you aren't going to be here. And,
Right.
and the question is it not something that is wise or prudent to think about, what if something were to happen? Because if you have X number of employees and a whole bunch of people that are dependent on you, are you just going to let something happen
Yeah.
randomly? And
Right.
what
You need a
what
plan.
happens to the firm?
Yeah.
So that's
Exactly.
why an exit plan, or the discussion about succession, is at some point you need to be thinking forward to look at what are alternatives. Do you sell it to another company? Do you have a family member? Do you transition it to someone? Or is there an insider? Do you have a group of people that work for you that would
Right.
like to buy? Do you sell it to them?
Yeah, and then you train
Or
them up, you have a whole plan for how to transition. It's a huge transition, right? I mean,
sure, and there's a lot of steps that you go through with that. So exit planning is, and especially for a private firm,
Mhm.
It's something that a leader needs to have something in mind or a plan about. Otherwise, that could
Yeah.
be very risk oriented for their employees and their
Yeah,
family and their relatives.
for
And
sure.
it's one of those difficult subjects that
Yeah.
meaning how many people want to contemplate their death?
Yeah, not a lot of us do, and sometimes not enough, frankly, because if we did a little better, we could have some areas in life that are more stable and in this case, really peace of mind for people who've come to work for you.
And there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot of fascinating stuff in that. And there's some movies about that, about the samurai and about, where do people contemplate what's going to happen? I mean, a
Hmm.
really good leader is someone who contemplates what will it be like if they're taken out or if they're
Yep.
not,
Yep.
because then you have to prepare the rest of the organization and the people you interact with
Right.
what might happen. And if you don't think about that, then you might as well go to Vegas and just say, well, what
Yeah, just gamble it
we're going to
away, right?
do. Well,
Right.
my exit strategy is to win at the blackjack table or something.
Right.
Or, that's
Right.
not a very good exit strategy.
Not a very sound choice, right? Well, and I didn't intend to talk more about my former boss, but in this case, I'll bring him back up again. John was a really, I did keep in touch with him over the last 20 years, and I ended up actually visiting with him in DC once a few years ago, and he was at the latter part of his journey with the company that he had built from 4 people to well over 200 in 2 cities, and he was in the middle of the transition plan. He took such care to select the person to follow him and to lead the company, and he didn't leave and not pay any attention to it, or and which some people do, and for whatever reasons is fine, right? But I just remember visiting with him at that much later stage and just continuing to have the same feelings of admiration around how he was handling that transition, the business, and just really always putting his people first. So I'll have to send him this episode and
Yeah.
share with him my appreciation, and I just know all of his employees have always felt that way about him. And
Well,
that's
it's
what
great
you
that
want to
I mean, it's
do.
great
Yeah.
that he did that or had that, that knowledge about kind of looking at, not that you can control the
Right.
future, you
Right.
can't control the future, but you can somewhat
Right.
plan for the future. It's different than saying that you can control the future, because
Right.
most of us can't
No,
control
I
the
mean, none of
future.
us really, except for our own actions. We can't control anything, right? And sometimes not even those. So, well, Steve, this has been
Yeah.
really fun. Can you share? Well, I like to close with some fun questions just to learn more about you. Would you mind telling us about someone in your life, whether, when you were young or, one of your phases of your career? Do you have someone in mind that really inspired you to do better, be better, manage better, work better, parent better, any of those things, that kind of someone who sticks out as a mentor?
Well, there really are several people, but one that really sticks out. It was in the corporate world when I was there for 16 years, and um, I happen to be Jewish, and but this person was someone that in Atlanta, one of the corporate people in Atlanta, and he came to me one day that the division I was in was reporting to, and they were going to make some choices and some growth, and he made a choice of putting me into a certain position in the marketing group, even though it was early in my career. He was giving me the opportunity to do something and learn. But at that time, I had a beard. I had a full beard,
Oh, you're kidding.
and
Great.
so he said, and he was just great about allowing people at an early age to take on and learn by doing. And I'll never forget some meeting that we were at when he was introducing me, and he would say, "Well, we're going to hear from Moses now. He's going to come step and tell you where this plan is going." And and someone who would add some levity into the situation, but it can be very meaningful,
Mm.
because there are stories about, if you go back to the Old Testament,
Yeah.
stories about
Yeah,
leadership
totally.
and tablets. And so I mean,
Yeah.
he was just a wonderful person to work for. And
Well,
he,
that's a
he was,
high compliment if he's calling you Moses with the 2 tablets. I think that's pretty cool. Wonderful. Well, that's a great story. And it just goes to show that we all have an impact on people we meet, and you never know when, if asked, that person might say your name, right? About, I'm
no,
sure somebody would say your name, and many people would, and we all have the opportunity to impact people at levels to help make them better people. So that's a great story. Final question. Are you reading a book or listening to a podcast or something that you're learning about? And even if it's just for fun, that you'd like to share and recommend to the audience today who's listening or watching?
well, there's so many. I have a list that actually some people ask me and say, what book do you recommend to my son or daughter, or someone's going to graduate college? And so I have like my top 10 list, and others that there's just a lot of very good ones. But one that recently was recommended to me that I did read, and it actually comes out of the medical field of doctors and surgeons. But the theme of this book is about execution, and it's about avoiding making mistakes, and how do you plan and execute properly. The title of the book is called The Checklist Manifesto.
Okay, the Checklist Manifesto.
Checklist Manifesto. And it's written by someone who was a doctor and was called in to look at why there were certain errors or deaths or certain steps that occurred, and how would you go about fixing that? How would you go about performing at a higher level? And he studied other fields and things that were very complicated, like a pilot on an airplane, where if you ever are entering an airplane and that cockpit door is open, and you look in there and you see a whole, dozens and dozens or hundreds of dials and
buttons and lights.
The complexity is, you look at that and say, well, how would these pilots know what to do or what sequence? Well, it actually is a very prepared environment and checklists that they have, because when it's so complicated or so many, people can't recall how to do all of those in the right sequence.
In a stressful situation, no less, right?
But they can be trained on what's needed when, and so you can think about it in a business or in some other environment about execution. The question is, so where's the checklist? And do people do they just make it up on the fly, or are they actually organized? And so this book deals with how you can put templates in place and use it to help manage the complexities of a business, of a company or a business. And it applies to lots and lots of places.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great analogy for lots of parts of life and business and relationships and whatever you might want to run by that, make a checklist for. So that's a great one. I'll have to drop that into a link of that into the chat when we post.
I mean, it's not just random. And another one, I use a lot of quotes and different things with some of these groups or some of these leaders, but another one that is similar to that is that a quote that I often say to people is, hope is not a strategy.
Yes, right. I think you might have written about that a couple of times. Hope is not a strategy.
We're going to develop this product, or we're going to develop this entity or this service, and we just hope it's going to. No,
that's not a strategy. Right. I love it. I love it. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today. How can people find you? What's the best place to find you? I mean, I know you're at LinkedIn. Do you have other ways you'd like for people here to reach out to you? Should they have questions about your program or working with you, or just
the LinkedIn profile has a lot of information, and then I do have a website called BrodyAssociates.net. I mean, in terms of my own coaching practice and other services, but it's BrodyAssociates.net. And so there's a website there that has a bunch of basic information that's available. And so there's plenty of ways to dig into a little bit more background.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Steve, I know that if it were me, I'm recommending to all our viewers and audience members to definitely link up with you at LinkedIn and to start following some of your posts, which are all just great values for readers and leaders, which I didn't realize rhymed until I just said that, but let's get those leaders reading your stuff and engaging and asking questions around.
Well, I will hold up one last thing you said, reading.
Yeah.
I did publish something. Here's a book that I published a few years ago.
Super.
That is called What Happens After the Sale.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually is a case history of one of my clients, of one of my members that was running a privately held company and decided that he and his partner were going to sell the business, and how they went about doing that was a whole stepwise procedure. And that whole story is described in this book of the steps that someone goes through to prepare for and go through a sale. And then comes the big question of, if you're fortunate enough and you sell something and you walk away with a whole bunch of money, but now there's the big dangling question that comes to that person, which is, so now what am I going to do for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
What do I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What
Then
do I
now
do?
what?
What do I do next? And that's kind
Yes.
of
Oh, that's super. That's so great. Well, Steve, I know, having worked with so many leaders who need someone like you, what kind of value you can bring. And so I hope our audience has gotten at least a little bit of a taste of that today. Leadership can be lonely, and it doesn't have to be. And I think there's such a common thread of the unknown and areas none of us have really read about in books or trained in school that we just need to experience. But with people like you along the way to help us guide our path, that's the wisdom that people need to tap into to hire someone like you or work with people that can build them up and make them better at their jobs for the people who work with them. So thank you for all that you do.
That's great. Oh, it's super. It's a fascinating world of in this niche of these areas of all these private companies, and there's just always something new or some surprise but it may be some old story, but it then happens again, because things tend to repeat themselves very often.
Yes, exactly. Wonderful. Well, we're out of time, Steve. Thank you so much. Everybody watching, Steve Brody at LinkedIn and Brody and Associates.net. Brody Associates.net is how you can find .net is how you can find Steve. So thanks, Steve. We'll put this up shortly, and stay tuned, everybody watching, for our next episode. Appreciate you all tuning in to Getting to the Point. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Cindy.